start in the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv, which was pounded overnight by the largest aerial assault of Russia's more than 3-year war. Hundreds of drones and missiles rained down on the city of nearly 3 million people. At least one person was killed in the hours-long attack.
Kyiv under an all-night attack. This building in the Solomyansky district is one of the targets of an aerial assault by Moscow. Residents are terrified of the waves of drone and missile attacks.
The basement shook. We all stood there just praying. Even the children were praying. You see what is being done? Is there a NATO military object here that they are so afraid of? There's nothing here. We're ordinary civilians, elderly people and children.
Rescue and cleanup efforts are in progress, while residents anxiously wait outside the building.
Luckily, nobody got seriously injured behind me when a Shahed drone hit the building just a few hours ago. Most people were inside the shelter, but everyone in the neighborhood is in shock. They are feeling that the attacks on Kiev are getting more and more frequent, and this time it even hit their own home.
Ukraine's Air Force said Russia launched over 550 drones and missiles during the night. The attacks damaged apartment buildings and other civilian infrastructure. Residents say their options to stay safe are limited. They either seek shelter underground or hope for good luck.
When you live in third year in the Ukraine there is war, and every day it can be drone attack, rocket attack, ballistic, it's like lottery. You can win, you can live or not.
Russian airstrikes on Ukraine have intensified recently, as ceasefire talks have largely stalled. For ordinary Ukrainians, it means Moscow's aggression is far from over.
Okay, straight to the Ukrainian capital then, where we find our correspondent Jan-Philipp Scholz. Welcome, Jan-Philipp. Let's start with those telephone discussions between the US and Ukrainian presidents. What have we learned?
The call seems to have been very productive. The presidential office called it very meaningful, and President Zelenskyy himself wrote that it was fruitful and very important. According to local media, the two presidents discussed the intensifying Russian air attacks, but they also discussed the possibilities of more air defense weapons for Ukraine and the possibility of possible joint project in this regard. Especially the last point is very important for Ukraine, of course, since it comes just a few days after the news that the US wants to stop some of the shipments. So all in all, the call seems to have been much more productive than yesterday's call between President Trump and President Putin, which, as you know, President Trump afterwards called very disappointing.
And how are people in Kyiv coping after such a heavy overnight attack?
Well, some hours ago, we went to some of the destroyed buildings and we found the whole neighborhood in shock. The intensified air attacks of the past 2 weeks have really had a very strong psychological effect on residents here in Kiev. Last night's attack was one of the most massive ones since the beginning of the war, especially when it comes to the number of drones employed, but also it was one of the longest attacks that we have seen so far. I was woken up by some strong explosions around midnight, and the missile strikes continued until the early morning hours. And what some experts say is very, very worrisome is that Ukraine could intercept a lot of the Shahed drones, but none of the ballistic missiles that were launched by Russia.
Okay, thanks for that, Jan-Philipp. Jan-Philipp Scholz in Kyiv. Well, Marina Miron is a military analyst in the Defence Studies Department at King's College London. Welcome back to DW, Marina. So last night's attack on Ukraine saying was the single biggest air attack of the war. What do you think is behind this dramatic Russian increase?
Good evening, Phil. Well, there are several reasons. First, and perhaps the most obvious one, was a Ukrainian drone attack on a military plant in Izhevsk, where some 35 people were injured and there are some dead amongst them. And so that could have been a response, of course, but we have seen increasing number of drones and missiles getting through Ukrainian air defenses. And one of the reasons is also the fact that Ukraine is running out of interceptor missiles. On the one hand, on the other hand, the Russians have ramped up their production, especially of Shahid-type drones. And they're using a lot of decoys. And since there is a new version of these Shahid drones, it could be that they still have to use up the old stock somehow. So they're using them in conjunction to ensure that the ballistic missiles that they should go through. So basically, those could be the reasons why we're seeing an increase, both in terms of numbers and in terms of missiles hitting something rather than being intercepted.
Right. So Ukraine has limited stock, so perhaps is using their air defense missiles more sparingly, even as Russia ramps up the pressure. This can't be sustained, surely.
No, absolutely not. And it's very expensive if you consider the fact that Shahid drones are fairly cheap compared to one interceptor missile, PAC-3 for Patriot, which is, if I'm not mistaken, around $4 million US, and a Shahid drone is maybe 40,000 US dollars, just an estimate. It's like the most expensive that it could be. So you can imagine, plus some of the drones are not actually drones carrying any sort of explosive charges. They are decoys in order to confuse, to overload air defense systems. So certainly, but even if Ukraine had enough interceptor missiles, it would still need to have layered air defenses in order to be able to defend itself against such strikes, because what we have seen last night has been quite a massive strike.
Right, and this, of course, as the US withholds some of its arms supplies. President Zelenskyy says he and President Trump discussed strengthening Ukraine's air defenses. What's that likely to look like, do you think?
Well, it's an interesting question because from my understanding, the U.S. doesn't have much of the capacity when it comes to producing interceptor missiles. And of course, the U.S. is still tied to the global supply chain, which is not very reliable, as we have seen when there was some tension in the Red Sea, so it affected the logistics. And so, from my understanding, perhaps President Trump will allow Ukraine to buy Patriot systems, whatever it has in stock. But we also have to bear in mind that the U.S. will most likely want to resupply Israel, which, again, used up most of its stock when it comes to interceptor missiles, and ironically, Israel too is using Patriot air defense systems. So you have that problem where you need to set priorities, who gets what first. And there is a possibility, of course, of supporting Ukraine when it comes to producing such interceptors domestically. I'm not sure in how far that is going to happen, because different companies produce different components of Patriot systems, including missiles. So will RTX, formerly Raytheon, be willing to open up a production site in Ukraine? That is a question, but that could be a possible venue.
Thanks for talking us through that, Marina. Marina Miron is a military analyst at King's College London. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Now, let's get further into this with Artis Pabriks. He's a former Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Defense and Foreign Affairs of Latvia. He's currently chairman of the Northern Defense Policy Center, and he joins us from Riga in Latvia. Welcome to DW. Thanks for joining us. We've just heard that there has been a phone conversation between US President Trump and Ukraine's President Zelenskyy. Do you know anything more about what was discussed between them?
No, I do not have yet this information, but I very much would like to hope that Washington and the White House is finally making more determined steps to support Ukraine, because crime is committed against Ukraine by Russia. And even if you are just a bystander and you do not interfere, or if you do not try to assist the victim, you are also co-responsible.
What about the conduct of the current US administration makes you believe that President Trump wants to assist Ukraine in its war against Russia?
At this moment, we do not have such signals, I would say. And it is a little bit puzzling and disappointing, because here on the northern and eastern side of European Union and NATO, of course, we are judging also our allies according to their commitment to Ukraine, because Ukraine is holding the ground also for those values and security, what is dear to us. And if this war is ending with defeat for Ukraine, or it is giving a grounds to think that allies are not fully involved in support, then of course it gives additional reasons for Putin to behave more aggressively against Europeans, all Europeans, not just Baltics, Finnish or Poles. And secondly, it is of course questioning the transatlantic alliance. No matter what politicians speak, what matters is what they do. And at this moment, support Ukraine is lacking there.
Isn't that the kind of signal that President Putin is getting? And I say that because in reference to the phone conversation that President Putin had with President Trump a day earlier, the Russian media was reporting that President Putin said Russia still will not back down from its war goals in Ukraine. So exactly what you just mentioned, are those exactly the signals that President Putin is getting currently?
Yes, because by every such silence from the Western side and from Washington, he's getting encouraged more and more. And we are, of course, more questioning what we could do in this regard. And clearly, if transatlantic alliance or our allies in US are hesitant to support Ukraine, then Europeans must step up this support, and to step up it not only with words, but with practicalities, for two reasons. First, Ukrainian defense is important for our own security. And secondly, we are ourselves not yet fully ready to embrace any kind of aggressive activities from the Russian side, either hybrid or full-fledged. And that means we Europeans, Germans, everybody must step up our security and defense. Again, not just by words, but by action.
You just said that you're not getting positive signals from the United States. Can Europe, or for that matter, any country, I mean, you are defense minister of Latvia, a country that shares a border with Belarus and Russia. Can you, for example, secure your country without active support from the United States?
Well, we know that no matter will we get any kind of support in the event of crisis of war, we will fight. And for us, it is important that we know that our allies are not only committed, but are also capable of supporting us, because this is what the reason why we are, for instance, in NATO. And we are definitely not doubting our neighboring states, either two other Baltic countries or Finland or Poland or Sweden. But we would like to have such encouragement and readiness also among other European nations and also from United States. Because again,
I'm sorry to interrupt, sir. What readiness are you talking about? There was just a NATO summit that concluded in June, where there was an attempt to have everybody sign on to an increase in defense spending, but you had certain holdouts and certain exceptions that were granted. For example, Spain will not be able to meet that 3.5% spending of GDP increase, and there are certain other countries that will also not be able to meet it. So if NATO can't get its act together, how can Europe be secured against Russia?
Well, we simply must do our homework. That's very clear. Because one thing is securing 3 or 5% of defense, and we are at this moment committed to 5%. But the other thing is what nation states do at home, how, for instance, also Germany is supporting their own military publicly and also with capabilities, with real capabilities. Because commitments and summits are very good, but we are practical people and we must understand how and with what forces, with what human capital, with what industry we will be able to deliver what we need to deliver. So, and this is not just, we don't ask this only from NATO summit and such meetings, but this is a question to every and each European capital, because money is there. We are rich countries. European common GDP in the world is about 17%, while Russian is maybe 2.5%. So how could it be that we do not have enough of finances and capabilities to stop the barbarian perpetrator and criminal? It's a puzzle.
We'll leave it there for the moment. Artis Pabriks, former Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Defense and Foreign Affairs of Latvia. Thank you so much, sir.